The story begins with one of the most dramatic turns in the information war between Moscow and Kiev. A battle not only for territory, but for truth itself. In recent weeks, Russian state media triumphantly declared that their forces had taken full control of the city of Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. High-ranking generals were congratulated, medals were awarded, and the President of Russia himself publicly praised what he described as a decisive step toward liberation. Official footage showed calm streets and Russian soldiers reportedly finishing off scattered groups of the enemy. Viewers were told that Kupiansk was firmly under Russian control and that the Ukrainian army was surrounded and defeated along the Oskil River. The narrative seemed airtight. It was supposed to symbolize the return of momentum for Russia after months of stalemate and heavy losses. But the celebration didn't last long. Beneath the surface of confident declarations, there were doubts. Whispers on pro-war telegram channels and cautious notes in military blogs. Some Russian commentators began to question why, if the city had been liberated, there were still reports of fighting on its outskirts. Others wondered why the Ministry of Defense stopped releasing fresh footage. Still, these questions remained muted, drowned out by triumphant headlines and Kremlin briefings that insisted everything was proceeding according to plan. Yet all it took was one short video to change everything. That video came from none other than Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky himself. On a cold December day, the Ukrainian leader appeared on camera standing near the Kupiansk city sign, a location that, according to Russian generals, should have been deep inside Russian-held territory. The footage was simple. Zelensky, calm and confident, speaking directly to the camera about Ukraine's ongoing fight and its resilience. The message was not just political, it was symbolic. His presence there shattered weeks of Russian claims and exposed the shaky foundation beneath Moscow's supposed victory. The Ukrainian president's brief visit sent shockwaves across Russian media circles, sparking chaos and confusion among propagandists and commentators alike. As the footage spread online, the reactions were immediate and explosive. Russian pro-war bloggers, the so-called Z channels, scrambled to explain the unexplainable. Some insisted the video was fake, blaming artificial intelligence or chroma key effects. Others suggested it was an old recording, a preserved clip from weeks earlier. But many began to admit, carefully and reluctantly, that something was deeply wrong. If Zelensky could safely appear in Kupiansk, then Russia's claims of liberation were false. The truth was now visible to the entire world. And yet, amid the uproar, the Kremlin remained silent, as if hoping the storm would pass on its own. What followed was a rare moment of visible fracture within the Russian propaganda system. Prominent pro-war commentators, who had once repeated every military announcement without hesitation, began to question the credibility of official briefings. One by one, they started posting messages asking how such a massive misunderstanding could have occurred. How could generals report total control over a city that was clearly still contested? And most importantly, how could such false information reach the very top of the Russian state? These questions marked a turning point in the information narrative surrounding Kupiansk, as the Kremlin's carefully constructed image of military competence began to unravel in real time. And as the discontent grew, new layers of intrigue emerged. Some insiders hinted that certain commanders had exaggerated their successes to win favor and earn state honors. Indeed, one general had recently been awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation, precisely for the alleged liberation of Kupiansk. But now, as Zelensky's video circulated, that same general's credibility was in question. Could the entire operation have been a political performance designed to show progress where there was none? Many Z bloggers quietly suspected exactly that. Meanwhile, Ukraine seized the narrative. Kyiv's media outlets emphasized the symbolic power of Zelensky's visit, framing it as a direct response to Putin's earlier invitation for foreign journalists to visit Kupiansk and see the truth with their own eyes. Now the truth was visible, but not the one Moscow had promised. Zelensky's appearance became a masterstroke in the psychological dimension of the war, demonstrating Ukraine's confidence and ability to defy Russian propaganda. It was not just a tactical moment, it was strategic theater at its finest. Stay tuned, because what happened next would send shockwaves not only through the corridors of the Kremlin, but also across the entire network of Russian military propagandists who suddenly found themselves forced to explain the inexplicable. The Kupiansk story was no longer about one city. It had become a mirror reflecting the cracks within Russia's war machine itself. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this investigation, because the deeper we go, the more startling the truth becomes. Part 2. When the news of Zelensky's appearance in Kupiansk broke, the entire structure of Russian military propaganda began to collapse under its own contradictions. The shock was immediate and visible. Just weeks earlier, on November 20, General Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of the general staff, had proudly reported to Vladimir Putin that the city was fully liberated. Footage of their conversation aired on national television. Putin asked for confirmation, and Colonel General Sergei Kuzovlev, commander of the Western Group of Forces, replied with confidence, "Yes, completely. The city is under our control." That very statement became the basis for awarding Kuzovlev the Gold Star of the Hero of the Russian Federation. The medal ceremony was covered across state media, a symbol of success, discipline, and momentum. But as Zelensky's visit to Kupiansk revealed, those grand declarations were built on fiction. The liberation of Kupiansk was in reality a mirage. What followed was a storm of contradictions, as pro-Kremlin channels and Z-bloggers began to turn against one another in search of someone to blame. Some accused field commanders of inflating battlefield reports. Others claimed the generals were victims of bad intelligence. But the uncomfortable truth loomed over all of them. Someone had lied directly to the President of Russia. Within a matter of hours, prominent propagandists like Maxim Kalashnikov, Kirill Fedorov, and the influential Rybar channel began to dissect the events with unusual caution. Kalashnikov, known for his fiery loyalty to the Kremlin, publicly asked whether Gerasimov would face consequences for misleading the head of state. Fedorov questioned how, after the announcement of the city's complete liberation, Zelensky could freely walk near the Kupiansk city monument and record a video. Rybar, one of the largest and most respected Z military blogs, admitted that Russian troops had never truly secured the city's outskirts. The entire narrative began to unravel thread by thread. As this wave of doubt spread, a series of explanations flooded Russian Telegram. Some users claimed the Ukrainian president's video had been shot weeks earlier and only released now for propaganda purposes. Others insisted that it was filmed in front of a green screen, a digital illusion. A few fringe accounts argued that Ukraine had briefly infiltrated the area just for the sake of making a photo opportunity possible. But these theories collapsed under the simplest scrutiny. The background of the video, the landmarks, the weather conditions, all matched recent satellite images of Kupiansk. Even Russian mill bloggers reluctantly acknowledged that the environment in the footage reflected the current situation. And so, the question that no one in Moscow wanted to ask became unavoidable. If Kupiansk was not under Russian control, what else wasn't? Behind the scenes, the tension within the Russian military establishment began to mount. Insiders spoke of growing frustration inside the general staff. Reports leaked suggesting that after Zelensky's video went public, senior officers were summoned to explain how such a strategic and reputational disaster had occurred. Kremlin officials, already facing international embarrassment, were reportedly furious that a single appearance by the Ukrainian president had undone weeks of triumphant messaging. For the Kremlin's propagandists, this was more than a setback. It was humiliation broadcast worldwide. The president of Ukraine had not only proven Moscow's claim false, he had done so calmly, confidently, and in daylight. At the same time, pro-war voices that once dominated Russia's information sphere started showing cracks of despair. Some turned to mockery and sarcasm as a form of self-defense. If we liberated Kupiansk, wrote one anonymous channel, then Zelensky has violated the state border of the Russian Federation or been captured alive. Others, like the neo-fascist DSHRG Rusich group, published ironic comments suggesting that the president of Ukraine had somehow entered Russian territory unnoticed, an unthinkable scenario for a country that claimed to have complete control over its front lines. For perhaps the first time since the full-scale invasion began, the myth of Russian operational dominance collapsed publicly and undeniably. But the chaos did not stop there. Within hours, Rybar published a lengthy analysis that directly contradicted the official Russian version of events. The channel revealed that many of the villages surrounding Kupiansk, Sobolivka, Moskovka, Sadova, which the Russian Ministry of Defense had previously listed as liberated, had never actually been under stable Russian control. According to Rybar, these territories remained contested or were completely unoccupied by Russian forces. The statement was a direct rebuke to the ministry's reports. Someone, Rybar wrote pointedly, has been sending highly distorted information up the chain of command, leading to premature declarations of victory. It was an extraordinary admission, not just of misinformation, but of systemic failure. For Ukraine, this moment became a rare informational triumph. Zelensky's short video resonated globally because it wasn't just a message of defiance, it was a masterclass in timing and symbolism. In a few seconds, he managed to expose Russia's falsehoods, energize Ukrainian morale, and remind Western allies that Kiev was still capable of fighting back, both militarily and psychologically. Ukrainian officials described the visit as a calculated risk, one that Zelensky took to demonstrate that Ukraine's leadership would not be intimidated. Analysts later noted that his team likely coordinated the brief trip with frontline intelligence units to ensure safety, choosing a location that was technically within reach but still accessible for a short visit. The move carried the same symbolic weight as his early 2022 videos recorded from Kiev during the first days of the invasion. Defiant, simple, and devastatingly effective. Russian propagandists, however, could not admit defeat so easily. Figures like Sergei Markov, a well-known Kremlin political analyst, attempted to reframe the narrative. He wrote that Zelensky's visit was not a sign of courage, but of psychological instability. According to him, the Ukrainian president was acting irrationally, driven by a need to insult Putin personally. Markov's tone was defensive, almost desperate, as he alternated between calling Zelensky reckless and mentally unbalanced. Yet his words revealed something deeper, a realization that the optics of this event were catastrophic for Moscow. No matter how he tried to twist the interpretation, the image of Zelensky standing freely in a city Russia had claimed as its own was impossible to spin into a victory. Other commentators followed a similar pattern. Some argued that Zelensky's visit was meaningless, that it carried no military significance. Others called it reckless showmanship. But the fact remained, if the city were truly under Russian control, such a visit would have been impossible. This contradiction haunted every discussion that followed. Even within Russian state television, anchors began to carefully avoid mentioning Kupiansk at all, shifting the focus instead to distant sectors of the front. The silence itself became an admission of defeat. Meanwhile, within the Ukrainian information space, the event was celebrated as a symbolic turning point. Analysts noted that it undermined not only the Kremlin's credibility, but also the morale of Russian troops. Soldiers who had been told they were fighting on liberated territory now saw evidence that the situation was far more uncertain. For them, Zelensky's visit was not just propaganda. It was proof that their leaders had been lying about the progress of the war. Ukrainian channels described the Russian reaction as a panic in slow motion, as bloggers, generals, and propagandists scrambled to protect themselves from the political fallout. The magnitude of this embarrassment cannot be overstated. It called into question the entire system of Russian military reporting, from battlefield commanders to the top of the hierarchy. The fact that a general could receive the nation's highest military honor for capturing a city that was not actually captured became the ultimate symbol of dysfunction within the Russian war effort. For international observers, the Kupiansk incident demonstrated once again the gap between Moscow's claims and battlefield reality. Western analysts compared it to earlier moments in the war, the fall of Liman, the retreat from Kherson, each time accompanied by similar denials and excuses before the truth eventually emerged. And yet, even as the Kremlin struggled to contain the narrative collapse, Russian propagandists continued their attempts to rewrite the story. They insisted that Kupiansk's situation was fluid, that Zelensky's video was taken on the outskirts, or that small scattered Ukrainian groups had briefly entered the area. None of these explanations withstood scrutiny. The coordinates of the location, verified by multiple open-source analysts, matched the exact position of the Kupiansk city marker, deep within the territory Russia had claimed as fully controlled 3 weeks earlier. The evidence was overwhelming, and still, the Kremlin refused to issue a correction or acknowledgement. Instead, state media simply moved on, as if nothing had happened. But for the growing number of Russians who rely on Telegram channels rather than state TV, the damage was already done. The myth of Russian infallibility had been shattered. The realization that their own military leadership could fabricate victories for political gain began to spread among soldiers' families, veterans, and even nationalist influencers. The sense of betrayal was palpable. "It's one thing to make mistakes," wrote one popular blogger, "but to lie to your own president, that cannot be forgiven." The cracks in Russia's propaganda wall were now too large to ignore. And while Moscow tried to silence the storm, the world was watching. Western outlets picked up the story, amplifying it across social media and international news cycles. The image of Zelensky in Kupiansk became the latest symbol of Ukrainian resilience and Russian disarray. The Kremlin's attempt to showcase control had backfired spectacularly, turning what was meant to be a victory parade into an information disaster. Kupiansk was no longer just a battlefield, it was a narrative battleground where truth itself became a weapon. Stay with us, because the third and final part of this report will take you even deeper into the aftermath of this scandal, the reactions from within the Kremlin, and the broader implications for both Russia's military leadership and Ukraine's ongoing counteroffensive. If you haven't yet subscribed, do it now, so you don't miss how this extraordinary story continues to unfold. Part 3. In the days that followed, the reverberations of the Kupiansk scandal spread far beyond the battlefield. Inside Russia, the silence from the top levels of power spoke volumes. Neither Vladimir Putin nor the Ministry of Defense issued an official statement addressing the contradiction between the earlier claims of liberation and Zelensky's very visible presence in the city. That silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured voices of anger, confusion, and disbelief. The normally synchronized chorus of pro-Kremlin media turned dissonant. Some tried to maintain the illusion of control, while others could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. For the first time in years, the Russian propaganda machine began to argue with itself. Colonel General Sergei Kuzovlev, the man awarded the Hero of Russia medal for allegedly capturing Kupiansk, became the center of controversy. His medal, once displayed as a mark of triumph, now symbolized deceit. Anonymous sources in Moscow hinted that internal investigations had been quietly launched, but no punishment was ever announced. The Kremlin strategy was clear: to bury the story under new distractions, new headlines, new offensives. Yet it didn't work. Independent analysts, military bloggers, and even some conservative commentators continued dissecting the event, pointing out that the entire chain of command had failed. When false reports reach the president, wrote a Z channel with hundreds of thousands of followers, it means the army is fighting two wars, one at the front and one against the truth. Meanwhile, Ukrainian and Western observers studied every reaction coming out of Russia. They noted how figures such as Yuri Podolyaka, a well-known Russian military commentator, began carefully rephrasing his language. Instead of celebrating victories, he spoke about tactical uncertainty and operational complexity. His tone shifted from confidence to cautious realism. In one of his longer posts, Podolyaka even explained how Zelensky's visit could have been executed. A quick, pre-planned arrival lasting only minutes, shielded by electronic warfare and short-range suppression of Russian reconnaissance drones. His analysis, though critical of Ukraine, inadvertently confirmed that the visit had been real. Coming from a Russian propagandist, that admission carried extraordinary weight. Other nationalist voices took a harsher stance. They accused the military leadership of incompetence and dishonesty, arguing that this debacle would damage Russia's credibility both domestically and internationally. Prominent Z-bloggers compared the situation to earlier humiliations: the withdrawal from Kherson, the retreat from Snake Island, and the chaotic collapse near Izium. Each time, wrote one, we are told everything is fine until the enemy records a video from the place we supposedly control. This is not just propaganda failure. It is strategic rot. Such words, coming from people who once championed the invasion, reflected how deep the disillusionment had become among even the most loyal supporters. In Kiev, Zelensky's appearance continued to resonate. Ukrainian officials described it as more than a gesture. It was a message to the world that Ukraine remained unbroken, that truth could cut through disinformation like a blade through fog. The video of his visit circulated across international media, replayed on channels from London to Washington. Western analysts interpreted it as a deliberate act of psychological warfare, a reminder that Russia's narrative could be dismantled by one authentic image. Military experts pointed out that the timing of Zelensky's appearance was not accidental. It came just as Western allies were debating the scale of further support for Ukraine. His confident presence near Kupiansk strengthened Ukraine's case for continued military and financial aid. It demonstrated leadership under fire, the very quality that Western capitals needed to see. As Russia's internal confusion deepened, independent Russian journalists operating abroad published long investigative reports about how false victories were routinely manufactured. They explained the system: field officers exaggerating progress to please superiors, generals rewriting battle updates to show forward movement, and state television turning even small advances into historic breakthroughs. This structure of self-deception, they wrote, had now reached a breaking point. The Kupiansk episode exposed the danger of that culture of lies. The system, one analyst wrote, is built not to win the war, but to sustain the illusion that victory is near. Kupiansk made that illusion impossible to maintain. Among the Russian elite, the incident created unease. Political technologists close to the Kremlin privately admitted that the loss of narrative control was more damaging than the battlefield setback itself. For years, Putin's regime had relied on the perception of competence, that even if progress was slow, it was steady and inevitable. Zelensky's visit shattered that perception overnight. Diplomats reported that in closed meetings, Western officials openly mocked the Kremlin's earlier invitation for journalists to visit Kupiansk. They don't need to, one European diplomat said. Zelensky already showed them what's happening there. The laughter in Western capitals contrasted sharply with the tense silence in Moscow. Inside Russia, fear replaced certainty. Telegram channels loyal to the Kremlin began deleting earlier posts celebrating the liberation of Kupiansk. Others quietly edited their messages, replacing "liberated" with "under ongoing operations." This collective rewriting of history was an attempt to erase embarrassment, but the internet remembers everything. Screenshots circulated widely, showing how the same channels that had once proclaimed victory were now pretending to have never done so. The episode became a case study in the fragility of propaganda, a reminder that even the most controlled narratives can crumble when confronted by verifiable reality. On the Ukrainian side, soldiers on the front lines reportedly greeted the Kupiansk incident with renewed morale. It was proof that truth could be as powerful as artillery. Commanders described a visible rise in confidence among units operating in the area. When the president came, one soldier told Ukrainian television, "It reminded us that we are fighting not just for land, but for honesty itself." Military psychologists later noted that symbolic gestures like these, brief, high-risk appearances, had measurable effects on morale. They reinforced unity, determination, and the belief that Ukraine's leadership shared the same risks as its soldiers. But for Russia, the psychological damage went deeper than propaganda failure. It raised existential questions about the credibility of its military structure. If the Kremlin could be misled about one city, how many other victories were illusions? If a decorated general could receive the nation's highest honor for a battle that was never truly won, what did that say about the value of truth in wartime Russia? These were questions that no state broadcaster could answer without crossing invisible red lines. And so, once again, silence returned. The silence of denial, the silence that has always been Moscow's final refuge when confronted with uncomfortable truth. Internationally, the Kupiansk story became emblematic of the larger struggle over reality itself in modern warfare. Analysts in Washington, Brussels, and Berlin cited it as a textbook example of hybrid warfare's informational dimension. Russia had built its campaign not only on tanks and missiles, but on the manipulation of perception, on the belief that if it could control the story, it could control the outcome. Yet in Kupiansk, that illusion collapsed. The world saw in real time how a single authentic image could dismantle a fortress of lies. The event will likely be studied for years as one of the defining moments of the information front in the Russo-Ukrainian war. As weeks passed, the Kremlin moved to redirect attention elsewhere. New statements about progress near Pokrovsk, Volchansk, and Konstantinivka filled Russian media. But the echoes of Kupiansk lingered. Every new claim of victory was now met with skepticism, even among loyal audiences. The once automatic trust in official reports had been replaced by a quiet doubt. Some of the most influential Z-bloggers began inserting cautious disclaimers into their posts. "Information requires verification," they would write, a phrase that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. This subtle shift in tone marked a deeper change in Russia's information environment. The facade of unity had been broken, and behind it, uncertainty spread like wildfire. For Ukraine, Kupiansk became a symbol of resilience. It reminded the country and its allies that even amid exhaustion and destruction, truth remained one of the most potent weapons available. The video of Zelensky at the city sign, brief, simple, defiant, became part of Ukraine's wartime narrative, alongside the early footage from Kiev, Bucha, and Kherson. It represented not just defiance but endurance, the refusal to surrender either land or truth